Some time ago I made a video on watercolour techniques. Now I've been wondering, are there any other watercolour techniques that are not, strictly speaking, normal? Hello, it's me Jules in week zillion of lockdown, making another video on drawing and publishing that travels down the airwaves and ends up in your device by some kind of devilish magic. Thank you, YouTube deity, for allowing this to happen. So I racked my brain cell to try and find out what a chap or chapess could do to manipulate watercolour. Something that might be just hanging around the house or that wouldn't really take too much effort to gather. This is what I discovered. First technique we're going to use is something you might have used if you've got little children or had little children at some point, but it's good fun. What we're going to need is some watercolour paint, and I'm not using a pan this time, I'm using a tube. It doesn't have to be watercolour paint actually, it could be any kind of pigment that's in a tube. I've got a straw, my paintbrushes, some watercolour paper and some washing up liquid. So first of all I'm just going to put some water into my plate. You need something fairly flat for this, and then add the pigment to it. And you do need to have quite a bit of paint in this. Make sure you mix it in. It could be poster paint, you know, it could be acrylic or really anything you've got hanging around. There we go. Nice pink. And then a few spots of washing up liquid. And first of all, look at that. Isn't that brilliant? Mix it in. The pigment is not going to like it. It's going to try and run away, but you are going to mix it in very thoroughly. I'm going to put a bit more washing up liquid in because it needs to get really bubbly. Then when you've got quite a few bubbles on the go, you just take your paper and right side down, just place it over the top very gently, and it will pop those bubbles. For the next technique, what you'll need is some sort of knife, like a Stanley knife or a scalpel. This one's quite useful because you can put your finger in like this and almost draw with it. And that's pretty much what we're going to do on the piece of paper. Is I'm going to scratch into it some areas of design. And then if you turn it sideways, you should be able to just about see where you've scratched that surface. And then when you go over it with some paint, ta-da! It collects like if you were a tractor going up and down ploughing a field. It just collects in those little areas that where the scratches are. For this one you're going to need some chalk pastels and some watercolour paint. So first of all I'm going to put down my pastel. I'm going to do a face. And this is just on watercolour paper. And then with picking up a little bit of paint, quite wet, just going to go over that, and you do see those kind of crispy lumps underneath. Give this chap some hair. But you pick up on those granular bits in the chalk pastels. They kind of just stay there, but they move around just a little bit, just enough, and then leave some areas where it's just pastel. For the next one, we're going to need some alcohol, just a tiny bit. We only need a few drops, and this is actually Souvenir, which is a Cypriot, Greek Cypriot alcohol. It's very, very strong, but if you use something like vodka or even something like rum or amaretto, that would do just as well. And you're going to need something to drop the alcohol onto the paper, and I'm just going to use a spoon for doing this. If you've got a dropper, then that would be perfect. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually just wet my paper. Put some pigment on. Let's use blue this time. Reasonable amount. And then I'm going to zoom in a little bit actually so you can see exactly what happens. Tiny, tiny bit of alcohol. Has this sort of weird, almost like marbling effect. Almost looks like a bit of bacteria or something. I think that's really awesome. And you can use this for just making a pattern. Or if you wanted to make it, maybe you were doing a monster and you wanted the eyes to look like this. Well, you do need to do those. Make sure you keep your paper quite flat, otherwise it will just pool away. A bit like when we used the scalpel to scratch away at the surface, you can also use sandpaper. So let's think about if I'm going to use just a square in the middle, square-ish, because it's a bit tricky to get it absolutely accurate. I'm just going to rub away that top surface. I'm going to make it kind of fluffy. And in being fluffy, it should pick up more of the pigment. That's the idea. Just roughs it up a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to use my big brush and some green. Hey, look at that. That really does make quite a difference, doesn't it? So if there's an area that you really want to show up on one of your paintings, if you rough the surface a little bit, it helps the pigment to absorb into that area so that it will be more prominent. Remember when you were a kid and you did that volcano experiment at school with vinegar and bicarbonate of soda? That's what we're going to be doing. So this is white vinegar, distilled vinegar, so it hasn't got a colour to it. If we use just normal malt vinegar, then it might stain the paper a little bit. And this is bicarbonate of soda. So I'm just going to lay down a colour to start with, and then I'm going to sprinkle on a little bit of our bicarb, and in doing that it will just start to make the pigment sort of pool in particular places, because if you've ever spilt anything on a carpet, you'll know bicarb is what you need to make sure you get that stain out. And then I'm going to splat on a little bit of vinegar, and it should have that reaction. Yes, it is. Does that bubbly reaction. And that will just really act as pushing away the pigment even further. You don't have to do it over the whole thing, you can just do it over certain areas, just to move that pigment around a little bit in a sort of slightly random way. Here's something that most of us got knocking around in the cupboard, just some oats. So I'm going to take my bit of paper and I'm going to lay some colour down, quite wet. Let's go with a slightly brighter yellow this time. And I'm just going to chuck on some oats, if I can get into the packet. Then you have to leave that to dry. This is actually grease-proof paper, but if you've got something like a sheet of acetate, that would work very well. And it was very curled up when I first took it out, so I've actually, once I've cut it out, I've ironed it. And I've cut out all these little leaf shapes. I'm going to lay it over the top of my paper, which it's almost fits. I've just got a tiny little bit left off there, off the bottom. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to use different sorts of different shades of purple. I'm going to start off with a very pinky purple at the top and go to a darker bluey purple at the bottom. And this is just one way of doing gradient. You do have to hold your greaseproof paper down onto your watercolor paper quite well as you're doing this, so you need 3 hands ideally. Didn't work terribly well for the first time, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to have another go, but this time I'm going to use a slightly bigger piece of paper, and I'm going to use paint that's not quite so wet, so more pigment, less water. Let's see if that works. And I'm also going to use my slightly smaller brush. I'm going to leave that for a little while just to dry a bit so I don't smudge it as I lift the paper. If you'd like further artist tutorials, I have a variety of short courses that will help you. There are real-time sessions looking at painting, drawing and marker pens, among others. And if you're keen on producing your own book, there is a more in-depth course on what you need to know about self-publishing a book with illustrations. And that covers making key decisions, how to make layouts and dummy books, rhythm and pacing, as well as several tutorials on illustrating your book, and a look at the tech. You can either hop over to my website or join me on Patreon for more information. Go on, give it a go. I think art is all about doing something that you haven't done before. Getting something wrong is an opportunity for growth, so said somebody really clever once. Trying something different is the definition of creativity. The opposite is just staying stagnant and not doing anything, not moving anywhere, not trying anything new. And frankly, nobody needs that in their life. If you found this video entertaining or devastatingly useful, make sure you give me a thumbs up. It really helps the divine ones know that my videos are worthy. And while you're down there, just press the subscribe button and ding that bell thingy to get notifications of all my uploads. I promise to bring further shenanigans and nonsense. Next week I will be on episode 6, can you believe it, of my Make a Picture Book series, where you're looking at my process of making my next picture book. Catch up on other episodes in the playlist. I'm off to can a kangaroo. I'll see you next time. Nanu nanu!